Sometimes you might want to add a feature to your Shiny app that isn't available in any of the many R packages out there. Luckily, a Shiny app, just like any other web application, is a combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So if the feature isn't out there, we can simply build it ourselves. In today's video, we're going to add a scroll to top button to a Shiny app. This button appears as soon as the user scrolls down, and when the user clicks on it, he or she gets redirected back to the top of the page. For this button, we need three things. One, the button itself, which we'll generate with some basic HTML. Two, some CSS to make the button look good. And three, some JavaScript that controls the behavior of the button. We will start very basic with the most basic Shiny app, and we will implement the button there, but we will also build it out a little bit further so it can be used with other layouts as well. Let's go. Here we have a very simple Shiny app with some long content. If I scroll down, a button appears. I can click on this button, and if I do, I get redirected back to the top of the page. Simple functionality that you're going to learn about today. So first things first, we need to add a button. This is the code of our simple Shiny app. It is just a basic app with a fluidPage and a div in it, which is just a very long div because it has a specified height of 200 pixels. We need to add a button to that, and we're going to do that with some plain HTML, no package involved. We're just going to say, hey, I want to generate a button. And we're going to do it with text. We're going to add an ID to that, and we are going to call it the scroll to top button. Scroll to top button. The content of the button is going to be a kind of an arrow up character, just to keep it very simple. You can also use an icon if you want. Just take a look at the Font Awesome library and look for the arrow up icon, I believe. So what we did now was just generate the HTML for a button with an ID that is scroll to top button. And out of the box, this HTML doesn't look extremely good. So that's why we would need some CSS. The CSS we're going to put in a file called stylesheet.css, and it's going to be located in the www folder of your Shiny app. In this case, the CSS is going to appear magically. And what this CSS does is for this button, so for the ID with scroll to top button, we're going to add some changes. Like, for example, we're going to add a nice blackish background color. We're going to make sure that the character that we put in it has a white color. And we're going to make sure that when people have their mouse located on, their cursor located on the button, that it actually becomes a pointer so people are aware that they can click on it. Furthermore, we will also add, on hover, we will change the background color of the button to a lighter gray color, just to improve the user experience. If we're going to save this, then of course we have to tell our Shiny app that there is a style sheet available and that it should be used. So in this case, we're going to use another tag, which is now the link tag. And in that we say, hey, we have a style sheet available that I want you to use. The type of the style sheet is going to be text CSS, and the href, so where it's located, is going to be the style sheet.css file. And by putting the file in the www folder, Shiny will know that the file is there, so you can just specify the href as the name of the file. So now we have the two main ingredients for our button. We have the basic HTML and we have the CSS. The only thing that's missing now is the actual functionality. So this is our app now. You don't see many changes and you don't see the button. And I will tell you why. I just opened the HTML inspector so that you can follow along. So in the HTML, we actually see that the HTML for the button is there with the ID scroll to top button. We also see that the style sheet is there. We also see that the styling for the scroll to top button is there. And if you paid attention to the CSS file, this is the exact content of what is in the CSS file, you also notice that we had the display property set to none. If we ditch that property for a second, you will see that the button indeed appears. If we retick it and set it to none, then it disappears. This is important because it's going to help us to show or hide the button when we want. Because if the user didn't scroll yet, we also don't want to show the button because there is no going upwards. We only want to show the button when the user did scroll down far enough. But this obviously raises two questions. One, how do we know how far the user did scroll? And two, how do we change the display property from none to something else? Block, for example. That's what we're going to do in our JavaScript file. So how do we know how far the user did scroll down the page? Luckily, in JavaScript, there is some functionality to get that information, depending on the browser, I have to say. So there are actually two ways which are very dependent on the browser. So for Safari, it's a bit different than, for example, Chrome or Edge. Since I'm using Safari here, I'm using this method, but in the code, as you will see a little bit later on, the other method is being implemented as well. So in the console, I can simply call document, document element, scroll top. And if I print that, I get the value 0. This means that the user didn't scroll yet because, well, that's correct, we didn't scroll yet. If we go down a bit, so in the Shiny app, and if we print that value again, then we see that it's, in this case, 378, which means that we have scrolled that many pixels down. So this functionality is going to help us in our JS file to determine whether or not we should show the button. Let's take a look. So back to our studio. We will create a JS file. We will call that file scrollpage.js, and we will put it along with the stylesheet.css file in the www folder. This is the outline of the JS file, a JS script that we're going to make. We will start with the window on scroll function. This means that whenever we observe that a scroll movement is being made with by the user in the browser, then we're going to call a function which we will call the scroll function. And we're going to write that scroll function now. So as we just saw in the HTML inspector, we can use this piece of code to determine whether or not a user scrolled more than 20 pixels down. And we want to know that because if the user did, we want to change the style of our scroll to top button to display block instead of display none. So we can do a simple if-else statement. So for example, if we see that indeed the user scrolled down more than 20 pixels, we will do something, and otherwise we will do another thing. The thing that we will do is first we need to retrieve the actual element that we want to change. And we can do that with document get element by ID, like that. And then we can specify the ID of our scroll to top button, which was scroll to top button. What we then want to do with that ID, we want to manipulate it. We want to change the style of that element and then specifically the display property. And we want to set that value to block in the case that the user scrolled down far enough. In the other case, we are going to do basically the same, but if the user didn't scroll down far enough, we want to hide the button again. So in this case, we choose display none. And this is our basic scroll function that's going to help us with hiding and showing the button when we want to. To see that in action, we obviously have to add our JS file to our Shiny app. So we can do that something similar to what we did with the stylesheet.css file, only now we will use not link, but we will use script. And here we will specify the source, which in this case is scrollpage.js. We also can specify the type, which in this case is text JavaScript, which apparently is super hard to write. Yeah, script. Once we did that, we can check if our code actually works. So running the app now, and if we scroll down, we indeed see that the button appears. And if we scroll up again, then the button disappears. Just what we wanted. The only thing is, I can hover over it now, and it looks like I can click on it, but it doesn't do anything. So we're still missing a vital piece of functionality, which is the onClick function. Obviously, we want to have some click functionality. So we're going to write another function, and that function we're going to call top function. So what this function is actually going to do, we're going to set back this scroll top property back to 0 when this function is being executed. So if we scroll down, let's say more than 20 pixels to, I don't know, 300, then when this function is executed, we go back to 0, which leads to us getting back to the top of the page. Now is also a good time to mention differences between browsers, because in Safari, this will indeed return the pixels that the user did scroll down, but on other browsers, that might not be the case. We're going to add a little tweak to our code, which makes sure that it will also work on other browsers like Edge, Chrome, or whatever you can think of. So in this case, we have document, but we're not using document element. No, we're using body, and then scroll top. It's just a very minor fix, but this ensures comfortability across different browsers. And what we then also need to do is we need to kind of duplicate this part in the if statement with an or. And we will replace this here with body. So in this case, we'll make sure that this script works in multiple browsers. So let's see what we then need to do, because in our Shiny app, we obviously have the button with an ID, but when it's being clicked on, we still need to tell that. So what we can do is we can add an onClick here. If we say onClick, we want to execute that top function that we've just written, then it should all be fine. And if we scroll down now and we do click on the button, then indeed we get redirected back to the top of the page. Perfect. Let's take a look at another type of application. So instead of using the basic Shiny functionality with the fluidPage, we might want to have an application written with bslib. And for example, we might want to have a page that has a navbar and different pages inside it. So in this application, we have a slightly different layout. We use page navbar from the bslib package. We do the same things as we did in the previous app, namely we're going to attach our CSS file, we're going to attach our JavaScript file, we're going to add the button with the top function button on click, and then we have different panels that have cards inside of them that are really long so that we have to scroll down. Let's see if it works the same. If we scroll down now, we don't see the button appear. And while this might not make sense on first sight, if we take a closer look, it actually does. Because the layout for a bslib page navbar is very different compared to our Shiny app that we saw in the beginning. The Shiny app we had in the beginning was super simple. We had just one page, one document, and when we scrolled the document down. In this case, you will see that we actually don't scroll the whole document down. The sidebar stays put, the navbar stays put. We are only scrolling a container inside the document. So if we are going to look at the console, and if we try to print the scroll top position like we did previously with documents, document elements, scroll top, then it will give 0 when we are at the top of the page, which is expected. But if we scroll down here, and if we execute it again, it will still give us 0. So the nice JavaScript file that we've written doesn't work in this case. We need some adjustments. If the document doesn't scroll, we need to find out which element or which container does scroll. Because if we can find it out, then we can target that specific element in our JavaScript file, and based on that, we can show or hide the button. So if we inspect the HTML a little bit closer, we will see that actually this div with role main and class main is the element that scrolls down. We can also see that because there's a little scroll indicator next to it. So we would need a way in JavaScript to target this specific class or this div with this specific role. So instead of using document body scroll top or document element scroll top, we need to target our main page or the div with class main. We can do that with a query selector. So we can say construct, and then we can say, hey, we want to select this element or this div which has class main, and we want to, for example, store it in a variable that we call main page. What we can then say is, instead of this, we can just say, okay, the main page, scroll top, needs to be greater than 20. Similarly, our top function, which handles a click, we could also say, hey, this main page, we want to set back to 0. So on first sight, this looked very good. We targeted the main page, so the scrollable element, and we get the scroll top from that. So we know how far the user has scrolled down. But the problem is, this element with the main class isn't available at the beginning. And the problem is that in our Shiny app, if we go back to that we kind of load the JS at the beginning. And at the beginning, that element with the main class isn't there. So we need an event listener. With this event listener, we're getting a little bit deeper into JavaScript, so bear with me, please. I promise that the end result, makes sense. But what we actually need to do is we need to say, hey, look, we want to listen for when you're actually ready with loading the content, because that content isn't there at the beginning when the Shiny app runs. So we want to add an event listener, and we want to say, hey, listen to when the DOM content is loaded. Love, how JavaScript, it just makes sense. It is so literal in its things. So you would just say, okay, this document, I want you to listen for when something happens, and that thing that needs to happen is the content should be loaded. In that case, we're going to execute a function. And this function, this needs to be like that. So when this content has been loaded, then we're going to query the element that has the class main. And we're going to call that the main page. Okay, now we have our main page. That is that specific element that can scroll. We want to add an event listener to there as well. And we want to listen for when that element is actually being scrolled. In that case, so in that event, we want to do something. And in what we want to do is then basically get the scroll position that we are currently at. So we can also make a variable for that. And we say scroll position, and we can say main page scroll top, just as we would do previously. If we have the scroll position, then we can simply take our if-else statement from here again. We can say, well, if this scroll position, which is now a variable, is greater than 20, then we want to target that button and we want to make it visible. So set style display to block. And in another case, we want to display that to none. Let's format that a little bit prettier. So then we actually don't need this scroll function again. So we can ditch that. Then we wouldn't need this part again. We still would need to handle the click event, because we previously used this function, this stop function, that we then specified in the app with the onClick argument. But we're also going to do that with an event listener, just to make it a little bit easier. We're going to do this inside whenever the content is being loaded. So inside this event listener, we're going to add an event listener on the button itself. So we can say, okay, we want to grab this element, this scroll to top button, and we want to add an event listener there, and we want to listen for a click. So we're not using scroll, we're using click in this case. When it's being clicked, we want to execute a function. And that function is very simply going to be, hey, we just set our scroll position, but we now want to set it back to 0. So we're going to take the main page, the element that we want to set back to 0. We're going to say scroll top is 0. If we do it like this, we don't need this stop function anymore here. So we can remove that. What we also can do in the Shiny app is we can remove this onClick top function because that function is not existing anymore and we're handling the click event in the JavaScript itself. Yep, the moment of truth. Let's see if our efforts did pay off. So if we scroll down now, we indeed see the button appear, and if we click on it, we get redirected back to the top. All good. But we don't have just one tab. No, we have two tabs in this demo Shiny app. The second tab has a little bit of a different layout. So this doesn't have a sidebar. Does it work here? If we scroll down, unfortunately, nothing happens. That means we're not done tweaking yet. Again, when we look at the HTML inspector, it actually does make sense why our JavaScript code isn't working. So if we look over here, we will see that the setup and the structure of the HTML is very different compared to the page with the sidebar. For example, here we don't have a div element with a class main. So we have to target the scrollable element a bit differently. This is a scrollable element because here we see scroll again, and we have different classes here. So we have tab pane, etc. All things that we can use to target the element and to know the scroll position of that specific element. In this case, we're going with tab pane. Note that there's a danger in that. The tab pane class is a class that could be visible in other elements as well, even elements where you don't want to have this scroll to top button. I'm choosing this here for convenience, but always be aware what can happen. The best option would even be to give this element a specific class and target that specific class in your JavaScript. So back to work. Obviously, we would still want to scroll to top button on the first tab and the second tab. So we not only want to target the elements with the class main, but also now with another class, namely tab pane. We can simply do that by just giving two classes here. And instead of using query selector, using query selector all. So select all elements that have a class main or tab pane and store them in main pages. We're going to change that so that we know that there could be multiple. And then we need to go and write for loops in JavaScript. So what we want to do is we want to add an event listener to every main page within that main pages construct. So what we can do is say main pages for each item that is in there, we want to do something. And that something is for every item that's in there, we want to add the event listener just as that we did here. So we have this whole event listener here. We are just going to copy that and paste that in here. What we would then have is that for every element, we get the scroll position of that element. And we need to change it here. So we need to get the scroll position of every element. And then based on that scroll position, we need to show or hide the button. We're just going to format that a little bit prettier. And that is our event listener for the scroll event. Then obviously we have to do the same for the click event on the button. Because when we now click on it, we want to set the main page back, the scroll top back to 0, but we now have to do that for multiple main pages. So within this function, I'm also going to make a loop, and we're going to say main pages for each item that is in there. Similar, I do like writing the plus instead of the equal sign. So for every item that is in there, we're going to do something, and we're going to set that item back to 0. And then we can remove this. One last look to see if it makes sense. We target different classes, and we want to Make sure that they are either the main class or the tab pane class, so there needs to be a comma there. Then for each main page, we're going to add an event listener on a scroll event, and in that case, we're going to hide or show the button. And here we will add a click event on the button, and we will set all the main page scroll tops back to 0, which needs to be with a capital here. Let's see what happens in the app. We're on the first tab, and if we scroll down, we see the button appear. If we click on it, we get redirected back to the top. And what about the second tab now? If we click on the second tab and we scroll down, we also see the button. And if we click on that, we also get redirected back to the top. Perfect. So in this video, you learned how to implement a scroll to top button in Shiny. As always, the full code is available on GitHub, and you can fetch the code there and play around with it yourself. If you like this video and want to see more videos in the future, please subscribe and you'll be the first to know when a new video pops up. Good luck implementing the button and see you next time!